Today I'm starting a new playlist that I plan to call The Clemens Family in Carson City. As you can see, I have my sketch of young Sam Clemens here. I also have a Nevada flag and a copy of Roughing It, and these will factor into my discussion today, especially young Mr. Clemens here. So what I'm doing is I'm setting up the background of Battle-Born Bride for you, because as a work of historical fiction, there is a lot that I included that were real people, places, and events. And of course, a couple of the major players in the book are Sam Clemens and his brother Orion, and their time in Nevada, and the connection between them and my fictional character, Sarah Jane Avery. So I thought that today I'd give you a little background about the arrival of the Clemens brothers in Carson City, Nevada Territory in August of 1861. Orion had worked on the campaign for Abraham Lincoln and was actually appointed to be Secretary of Nevada Territory. At the time, Governor Nye, James Warren Nye, was the leader of Nevada territorial government. He had started putting together his government in July of 1861. So the Clemens brothers arrived in Carson City in August of 1861. Prior to that, Sam Clemens, the younger brother here, was doing a bit of this and that, and Orion himself did the same thing as well. He eventually studied law, and that was how he became involved in the campaign of Abraham Lincoln. But Sam really hadn't settled on a job per se, a career. He had been a riverboat captain probably most recently. He'd worked for his brother a little bit, and he actually used the proceeds from his time as a riverboat captain to buy his ticket to Nevada Territory, where he was theoretically supposed to be the secretary to his brother, who was the Nevada Territorial Secretary. As I mentioned, Samuel and Orion ended up in Carson City in August of 1861, and Orion later built a house and brought his wife Molly and daughter Jenny out. So his wife and daughter would have arrived in 1862. My main character, Sarah Jane Avery, arrives in August of 1863, or I believe, no, maybe it was September of 1863. The inciting incident of Battle-Born Bride is happening in August of 1863. So Sarah Jane and her mother Constance arrive in Nevada Territory in 1863 after the Clemens brothers have already been in the territory for a couple of years. By that point, Sam Clemens had been doing a little bit of this and that along the way, and he was working as a journalist with the Territorial Enterprise in Virginia City. But he often visited with his brother Orion in Carson City. He wanted to be involved with things that were going on in the territorial legislature, and he started something he called the Third House during the territorial legislative session. So he is a big player in the local communities when Sarah Jane arrives. He is on the verge of becoming Mark Twain. So with that in mind, I thought I would read a little bit from Roughing It about, let me see, I'll show you the full cover here. There we go, Roughing It. So this will be in his own words, keeping in mind the fact that Mark Twain tended to exaggerate. That was a large part of his popularity, was he tended to exaggerate his stories, and that does factor into what happens in Battle-Born Bride. Let me move this out of the way. Okay, so this is chapter 21 of Roughing It, and if I can, I will pop in some of the illustrations. I have the book, but I am reading off of my computer. I'm looking at Project Gutenberg, where they digitize and upload versions of older books for public consumption, because it's easier for me to read with my vision at my age. So I'll read from this, and if I can, I will pop in the images that they included in this as we go along. But keeping in mind, this is August of 1861. This is Mark Twain, who at the time was Samuel Clemens, and his thoughts on arriving in Carson City. Once I'm done reading this, I will give you my impressions of his comments on Carson City and how much I find to be true. We were approaching the end of our long journey. It was the morning of the 20th day. At noon, we would reach Carson City, the capital of Nevada Territory. We were not glad, but sorry. It had been a fine pleasure trip. We had fed fat on wonders every day. We were now well accustomed to stage life and very fond of it, so the idea of coming to a standstill and settling down to a humdrum existence in a village was not agreeable, but on the contrary, depressing. Visibly, our new home was desert, walled in by barren, snow-clad mountains. There was not a tree in sight. There was no vegetation but the endless sagebrush and greasewood. All nature was gray with it. We were plowing through the great deeps of powdery alkali dust that rose in thick clouds and floated across the plain like smoke from a burning house. We were coated with it like millers. So were the coach, the mules, the mailbags, the driver. We and the sagebrush and the other scenery were all one monotonous color. Long trains of freight wagons in the distance, enveloped in ascending masses of dust, suggested pictures of prairies on fire. These teams and their masters were the only life we saw. Otherwise, we moved in the midst of solitude, silence, and desolation. Every 20 steps, we passed the skeleton of some dead beast of burden, with its dust-coated skin stretched tightly over its empty ribs. Frequently, a solemn raven sat upon the skull or the hips and contemplated the passing coach with meditative serenity. By and by, Carson City was pointed out to us. It nestled in the edge of a great plain and was a sufficient number of miles away to look like an assemblage of mere white spots in the shadow of a grim range of mountains overlooking it, whose summits seemed lifted clear out of companionship and consciousness of earthly things. We arrived, disembarked, and the stage went on. It was a wooden town, its population 2,000 souls. The main street consisted of 4 or 5 blocks of little white frame stores, which were too high to sit down on, but not too high for various other purposes. In fact, hardly high enough. They were packed close together, side by side, as if room were scarce in that mighty plain. The sidewalk was of boards that were more or less loose and inclined to rattle when walked upon. In the middle of the town, opposite the stores, was the plaza, which was native to all towns beyond the Rocky Mountains, a large, unfenced, level vacancy with a liberty pole in it, and very useful as a place for public auctions, horse trades, and mass meetings, and likewise for teamsters to camp in. 2 other sides of the plaza were faced by stores, offices, and stables. The rest of Carson City was pretty scattering. We were introduced to several citizens at the stage office and on the way up to the governor's from the hotel. Among others, to a Mr. Harris, who was on horseback. He began to say something, but interrupted himself with the remark, "I'll have to get you to excuse me a minute. Yonder is the witness that I swore I helped to rob the California coach. A piece of impertinent intermeddling, sir, for I am not even acquainted with the man." Then he rode over and began to rebuke the stranger with a 6-shooter, and the stranger began with another. When the pistols were emptied, the stranger resumed his work, mending a whiplash, and Mr. Harris rode by with a polite nod, homeward bound, with a bullet through one of his lungs and several in his hips, and from them issued little rivulets of blood that coursed down the horse's side and made the animal look quite picturesque. I never saw Harris shoot a man after that, but it recalled to mind that first day in Carson. This is all we saw that day, for it was 2 o'clock now, and according to custom, the daily wash of zephyr set in. A soaring dust drift about the size of the United States set up edgewise came with it, and the capital of Nevada Territory disappeared from view. Still, there were sights to be seen, which were not wholly interesting to newcomers, for the vast dust cloud was thickly freckled with things strange to the upper air, things living and dead, that flitted hither and thither, coming and going, appearing and disappearing among the rolling billows of dust. Hats, chickens, and parasols sailing in the remote heavens, blankets, tin signs, sagebrush, and shingles a shade lower, doormats and buffalo robes lower still, shovels and coal scuttles on the next grade, glass doors, cats, and little children on the next, disrupted lumber yards, light buggies, and wheelbarrows on the next, and down only 30 or 40 feet above ground was a scurrying storm of emigrating roofs and vacant lots. It was something to see that much. I could have seen more if I could have kept the dust out of my eyes. But seriously, a Washoe wind is by no means a trifling matter. It blows flimsy houses down, lifts shingle roofs occasionally, rolls up the tin ones like sheet music, now and then blows a stagecoach over and spills the passengers. And tradition says the reason there are so many bald people there is that the wind blows the hair off their heads while they're looking skyward after their hats. Carson streets seldom look inactive on summer afternoons because there are so many citizens skipping around their escaping hats like chambermaids trying to head off a spider. The Washoe Zephyr, Washoe is a pet nickname for Nevada, is a peculiar scriptural wind, in that no man knoweth whence it cometh. That is to say, where it originates. It comes right over the mountains from the west, but when one crosses the ridge, he does not find any of it on the other side. It probably is manufactured on the mountaintop for the occasion and starts from there. It is a pretty regular wind in the summertime. Its office hours are from 2 in the afternoon till 2 the next morning, and anybody venturing abroad during those 12 hours needs to allow for the wind, or he will bring up a mile or two leeward of the point he is aiming at. And yet the first complaint a Washoe visitor to San Francisco makes is that the sea wind blows so. There is a good deal of human nature in that. We found the state palace of the governor of Nevada Territory to consist of a white frame one-story house with 2 small rooms in it and a stanchion-supported shed in front for grandeur. It compelled the respect of the citizen and inspired the Indians with awe. The newly arrived chief and associate justices of the territory and other machinery of the government were domiciled with less splendor. They were boarding around privately and had their offices in their bedrooms. The secretary and I took quarters in the ranch of a worthy French lady by the name of Bridget O'Flanagan, a camp follower of His Excellency the Governor. She had known him in his prosperity as Commander-in-Chief of the Metropolitan Police of New York, and she would not desert him in his adversity as Governor of Nevada. Our room was on the lower floor, facing the plaza, and when we had got our bed, a small table, 2 chairs, the government fireproof safe, and the unabridged dictionary into it, there was still room enough left for a visitor. Maybe 2, but not without straining the walls. But the walls could stand it, at least the partitions could, for they consisted simply of one thickness of white cotton domestic stretched from corner to corner of the room. This was the rule in Carson. Any other kind of partition was the rare exception. And if you stood in a dark room and your neighbors in the next had lights, the shadows on your canvas told queer secrets sometimes. Very often these partitions were made of old flour sacks basted together, and then the difference between the common herd and the aristocracy was that the common herd had unornamented sacks, while the walls of the aristocrat were overpowering with rudimentary fresco, i.e., red and blue mill brands on the flour sacks. Occasionally, also, the better classes embellished their canvas by pasting pictures from Harper's Weekly on them. In many cases, too, the wealthy and cultured rose to spittoons and other evidences of sumptuous and luxurious taste. Washoe people take a joke so hard that I must explain that the above description was only the rule. There were many honorable exceptions in Carson, plastered ceilings and houses that had considerable furniture in them. M.T. We had a carpet and a genuine queensware washbowl. Consequently, we were hated without reserve by the other tenants of the O'Flanagan Ranch. When we added a painted oilcloth window curtain, we simply took our lives into our own hands. To prevent bloodshed, I removed upstairs and took up quarters with the untitled plebeians in one of the 14 white pine cot bedstands that stood in 2 long ranks in the one sole room of which the second story consisted. It was a jolly company, the 14. They were principally voluntary camp followers of the governor who had joined his retinue by their own election at New York and San Francisco and came along, feeling that in the scuffle for little territorial crumbs and offices, they could not make their condition more precarious than it was, and might reasonably expect to make it better. They were popularly known as the Irish Brigade, though there were only 4 or 5 Irishmen among all the governor's retainers. His good-natured Excellency was much annoyed at the gossip his henchmen created, especially when there arose a rumor that there were paid assassins of his brought along to quietly reduce the Democratic vote when desirable. Mrs. O'Flanagan was boarding and lodging them at $10 a week apiece, and they were cheerfully giving their notes for it. They were perfectly satisfied, but Bridget presently found that notes that could not be discounted were but a feeble constitution for a Carson boarding house. So she began to harry the governor to find employment for the brigade. Her importunities and theirs together drove them to a gentle desperation at last, and he finally summoned the brigade to the presence. Then said he, "Gentlemen, I have planned a lucrative and useful service for you, a service which will provide you with recreation amid noble landscapes and afford you never-ceasing opportunities for enriching your minds by observation and study. I want you to survey a railroad from Carson City westward to a certain point. When the legislature meets, I will have the necessary bill passed and the remuneration arranged." "What? A railroad over the Sierra Nevada mountains?" "Well, then, survey it eastward to a certain point." He converted them into surveyors, chain bearers, and so on, and turned them loose in the desert. It was recreation with a vengeance. Recreation on foot, lugging chains through sand and sagebrush, under a sultry sun, and amid cattle bones, coyotes, and tarantulas. Romantic adventure could go no further. They surveyed very slowly, very deliberately, very carefully. They returned every night during the first week, dusty, footsore, tired, and hungry, but very jolly. They brought in great store of prodigious hairy spiders, tarantulas, and imprisoned them in covered tumblers upstairs in the ranch. After the first week, they had to camp on the field, for they were getting well eastward. They made a good many inquiries as to the location of that indefinite certain point, but got no information. At last, to a particularly urgent inquiry of how far eastward, Governor Nye telegraphed back, "To the Atlantic Ocean, blast you, and then bridge it and go on." This brought back the dusty toilers, who sent in a report and ceased from their labors. The governor was always comfortable about it. He said Mrs. O'Flanagan would hold him for the brigade's board anyhow, and he intended to get what entertainment he could out of the boys. He said, with his old-time pleasant twinkle, that he meant to survey them into Utah and then telegraph Brigham to hang them for trespass. The surveyors brought back more tarantulas with them, and so we had quite a menagerie arranged along the shelves of the room. Some of these spiders could straddle over a common saucer with their hairy, muscular legs, and when their feelings were hurt or their dignity offended, they were the wickedest-looking desperadoes the animal world could furnish. If their glass prison houses were touched ever so slightly, they were up and spoiling for a fight in a minute. Starchy? Proud? Indeed, they would take up a straw and pick up their teeth like a member of Congress. There was, as usual, a furious zephyr blowing the first night of the brigade's return, and about midnight the roof of an adjoining stable blew off, and a corner of it came crashing through the side of our ranch. There was a simultaneous awakening, and a tumultuous muster of the brigade in the dark, and a general tumbling and sprawling over each other in the narrow aisle between the bedrows. In the midst of the turmoil, Bob H. sprung up out of a sound sleep and knocked down a shelf with his head. Instantly he shouted, "Turn out, boys! The tarantulas is loose!" No warning ever sounded so dreadful. Nobody tried any longer to leave the room lest he might step on a tarantula. Every man groped for a trunk or a bed and jumped on it. Then followed the strangest silence. A silence of grisly suspense it was, too. Waiting expectancy, fear. It was as dark as pitch, and one had to imagine the spectacle of those 14 scant-clad men roosting gingerly on trunks and beds, for not a thing could be seen. Then came occasional little interruptions of the silence, and one could recognize a man and tell his locality by his voice, or locate any other sound a sufferer made by his gropings or changing of position. The occasional voices were not given to much speaking. You simply heard a gentle ejaculation of "ow!" followed by a solid thump, and you knew the gentleman had felt a hairy blanket or something touch his bare skin and had skipped from a bed to the floor. Another silence. Presently you would hear a gasping voice say, "Something's crawling up the back of my neck." Every now and then you could hear a little subdued scrambled and sorrowful, "Oh, Lord," and then you knew that somebody was getting away from something he took for a tarantula and not losing any time about it either. Directly a voice in the corner rang out wild and clear. "I've got him! I've got him!" Pause and probable change of circumstances. "No, he's got me! Oh, it ain't they never gonna fetch me a lantern?" The lantern came at that moment in the hands of Mrs. O'Flanagan, whose anxiety to know the amount of damage done by the assaulting roof had not prevented her waiting a judicious interval after getting out of bed and lighting up to see if the window was done now upstairs or had a larger contract. The landscape presented when the lantern flashed about the room was picturesque and might have been funny to some people, but was not to us. Although we were perched so strangely upon boxes, trunks, and beds, and so strangely attired, too, we were too earnestly distressed and too genuinely miserable to see any fun about it, and there was not the semblance of a smile anywhere visible. I know I am not capable of suffering more than I did during those few minutes of suspense in the dark, surrounded by those creeping, bloody-minded tarantulas. I had skipped from bed to bed and from box to box in a cold agony, and every time I touched anything that was furzy, I fancied I felt the fangs. I had rather go to war than live that episode over again. Nobody was hurt. Not one of those escaped tarantulas was ever seen again. There were 10 or 12 of them. We took candles and hunted the place high and low for them, but with no success. Did we go back to the bed then? We did nothing of the kind. Money could not have persuaded us to do it. We sat up the rest of the night playing cribbage and keeping a sharp lookout for the enemy. Now, I can't say that I've seen a lot of tarantulas here in Carson City, but I will say that at one point JT and I were out looking at houses in Dayton, which is just to the east of us, and there were enormous tarantulas out there. There was one so big crossing the road that we could clearly see it from the car as night was falling, and so I would not be surprised if those tarantulas were all over Carson City back before it became so much more well established. He wasn't really exaggerating much about the Washoe zephyrs that we get here. The winds can be very prevalent in the afternoons. I do like his descriptions of all the different levels of wind and how you would find hats in one and buggies in another one and children in another one. The wind here, if you don't batten things down well enough, you'll definitely see things go flying. I have seen videos, not seen it personally, but I have seen videos of people who have trampolines in their backyard, the trampoline being lifted up and set down in someone else's yard. So those winds are no joke. They will tear shingles off of a roof if the shingles are loose. So he wasn't exaggerating much about the Washoe Zephyr. And there tends to be wind in California, but not as strong as the Washoe Zephyr. Also, if we're traveling through Washoe Valley between Carson City and Reno during the windiest parts of the day, it can shake the car, something fierce. So him talking about the wind knocking over a stagecoach is entirely possible because they recommend that big rigs, semi-trucks, do not go through the valley, or other large, high-profile vehicles for that very reason, because they will get blown over. We have seen many a semi-truck blown over through the valley. There are actually wind warning lights that are supposed to activate when the winds are so strong that the trucks need to divert around the 395 that goes straight through the center of the valley. So tarantulas and wind, he really wasn't exaggerating about that very much. I don't know whether the men he was boarding with would have actually brought a number of tarantulas back to their room with them. I think that might have been the exaggeration, but who knows? I mean, people in the 19th century had maybe strange ideas of entertainment. Maybe they thought coming out to the area, this might have been the first time they were seeing tarantulas if they had come from the east. So I suppose it's possible they might have collected tarantulas and brought them back with them, but I don't know if they would have brought that many. So even though parts of this chapter are factual and not too heavily, exaggerated for his story, there are definitely parts that I wonder about. And I do know that Carson City at that time was probably made up of a lot of wooden buildings. Famously, the church where my husband and I got married, St. Teresa's on the the west side of Carson City, at that time was a wooden structure that I have heard was blown down in a windstorm, and they rebuilt the building with brick. So when JT and I got married there, it was a brick structure, and it had been heavily altered over the 120 years since it was first constructed. So by the time we were married in that church, it was much different from the original one. But then again, the original one blew down in a windstorm. So the discussion about the Washer Zephyr, not too much of an exaggeration, but again, I do like his descriptions of how you find different things in the different levels of the wind. The alkali dust, I'm not sure we have a lot of alkali around Carson City. We are in Eagle Valley, and the Carson River flows through this valley, so there is a lot of sand, but I don't know that I've seen a lot of alkali. There is definitely a lot more alkali to the east of us, so I think maybe he was just talking about the drive into Carson City in that case, because you don't have to go too far east to find a lot of alkali flats. And that dust will definitely blow all over the place and coat you. My dad worked for a company that dealt with gypsum, and the gypsum dust would stick to everything. And if you got it a little wet, it turned into this really hard goo, or not goo, a hard crust that would coat everything. It was very hard to clean. It drove my mother up the wall. So gypsum and alkali dust, definitely messy substances. And his idea that everything was brown and coated with this alkali dust, coming into the area in August, it would definitely be brown because it would have been dry for a while. I don't know that the area had many trees at that point in time. There were obviously trees along the riverbanks. I know a lot of the local cottonwoods in Carson City were planted by people who had come here because they needed shade. At that time, it was the Comstock load was going, so a lot of the evergreens had been cut down to take to Virginia City to create the square set timbering that would hold up those mines. So they would set up square set timber framing within the mines to try to protect the miners. So a lot of trees were cut down in the Sierra Nevada just to the west of us. So there probably were not a lot of trees in the area. And if the people who came to Carson City in Nevada Territory at that time were planting trees, the trees would have been saplings, so they definitely wouldn't look very big and majestic like some of the trees back east. Orion and Sam came from the Midwest, so things would have been a lot greener and more lush there. There is a very distinct difference between the Midwest and the Western United States, at least in the Great Basin region. So he wasn't really exaggerating about his descriptions of the dust and the wind and the tarantulas, but the extra little nuances that he put into his book were, they kind of took it to the next level. And that's why I think people enjoy reading Mark Twain so much. He is very fond of hyperbole. He loves to exaggerate things. And that love of exaggeration does factor into Battleborn Bride. So that's part one of the Clemens family in Carson City. I'm going to continue this little playlist. I'm not sure if I'll be doing this on a daily basis or if I'll do a few here and there throughout the coming couple of months. But I do plan to go out and film some footage of the house that Orion built over in West Carson City. It does still stand, even though it doesn't look anything like it did originally. I will be going to visit the grave of Jenny Clemens. I can go visit the church that they attended and various other locations related to the Clemens family in Carson City. So that video should be coming very soon. I will be also talking more about Sam Clemens himself, what he was doing in Carson City, what kind of, he kind of came and went because he was also trying to do a little mining on his own to make it rich quick and never had much success at that. So there's a lot more to talk about, and I hope if you're interested, you'll follow along. I hope that you will be interested enough to check out the pre-order for Battleborn Bride. The ebook is now on pre-order across numerous platforms, so I'm not sure if we have them updated on our website just yet. I will put the link to the Amazon pre-order down below, but through Draft to Digital, we now have multiple platforms with the pre-order for the ebook active. So I'm hopeful that people will start checking that out. And the paperback version is still in progress. We aren't yet able to order our proof copy, but I'm hoping it will be very soon so that I can get that approved and start ordering my author copies, because getting author copies in time for events is becoming a lot more challenging for many authors, not just myself. So we'll see how that goes. And we're ordering our author copies from Draft to Digital this time around because we used a single ISBN for the paperbacks and we're allowing Draft to Digital to push them out widely. So we will not be able to order the author copies from Amazon, which is actually our least expensive option on our end. So the paperbacks will be a tiny bit more. I think they're around $15, $16, something like that. They're not enormously expensive, but they're probably a little bit more expensive than they would have been. So we are trying some new things with this release. If this works out going forward, we may just do Draft to Digital for everything and go from there. And we kind of have to decide which things that we are willing to deal with. But like I was saying, this is part one of the Clemens family in Carson City. I hope you enjoyed the reading from Roughing It. This was published or the original version of this was published in 1872. So it was after Mark Twain had left, or Sam Clemens, who became Mark Twain, after he left Nevada for other places. He went to Hawaii, he went back east. I believe he ended up living in Connecticut. I'll have to verify that, but he wrote this after his time in the West and after he had started to make a name for himself by writing and making speaking engagements and things like that. So that's kind of on the path that I'm on right now. I'm hoping Battleborn Bride will lead to some speaking engagements, and I'll definitely be providing more details about those as I go forward. I do have the one appearance next week at the Churchill County Library in Fallon. That's actually next Tuesday, August 25th at 6 p.m. I won't be discussing Battleborn Bride at that one. That will be just about my contemporary romances. But in the future, hopefully I'll be able to do it again and discuss Battleborn Bride in greater detail, because I really hope that people will find this book enjoyable. I will say that I am not writing with as much exaggeration as Mr. Twain did. I'm trying to make it a little bit more realistic. So I don't know. If you're expecting this, you're not going to find it in Battleborn Bride. But that was something of a fun video for me. I hope it was enjoyable for you. I hope you enjoyed the reading, and that this was also kind of a test of me reading for audiobooks. Obviously, I would spend more time editing, and if I had a break point where I misspoke, I would definitely edit that out and make it smoother. But I think overall I can read well enough to be able to record my own audiobook. So that is something else I plan to do with Battleborn Bride. I don't know that it will be ready at the same time that the ebook and the paperbacks are in wide release, but I'm hoping maybe by the end of the year to have an audiobook version available as well. So I thank you for joining me. Starting to lose my voice a little bit. I talked a lot longer than I meant to this morning, but I thought this would be a fun way to kick off my Clemens family in Carson City video series. And like I said, if you come across this video and you want to follow along, please subscribe. You can follow along with that particular playlist, or you can follow the channel as a whole. I have been posting daily throughout 2026 and will continue to do so for the rest of the year. I talk about writing, I talk about editing, I talk about publishing, I talk about my inspirations, and I talk about my life in general. So there's a lot of different things to see and hear about on this channel. And also my husband and I do 2 podcasts, which are on his YouTube channel, the Nevada Author Network collaboration with the Sierra Arts Foundation and the Sierra Arts Literary Community, and the CC&JT Amateur Hour, which is our weekly podcast where he and I sit down and talk to each other. We're also going to be restarting author interviews on that podcast, but we'll be interspersing those with our regular Sunday podcasts. We'll be doing author interviews on Wednesdays, I believe. So there's a lot more coming up. There's a lot to catch up on because we have probably more than 300 episodes of the CC&JT Amateur Hour available right now. Those are all mostly writing related, and some of them have been done on the road. I know we recorded a couple of them in Canada. So, we are travelers. We haven't done it this year much, but we will be getting back to that. So, you can follow along on all of our adventures. You can find the most information about us at our website at www.carsonhume.com. That will link you to our bookstore. It will link you to our podcasts. It will link you to our social media platforms. And you can keep up with everything that we've been doing. So I thank you for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed this. If you decided to stop and check out the Mark Twain content, please be sure to at least check in every once in a while, because more will be coming in the near future. But this is not an all Mark Twain channel, so it's more of a writer's channel, or as I say, the life of a writer. So you can expect a lot of different types of videos based on that. Anyway, thank you again for joining me. I hope you're having a wonderful day and week so far, and I will chat with you again tomorrow. I'm Cassidy Carson, and this is The Life of a Writer. Take care.